The love triangle in the Hunger Games trilogy is widely criticized. And if you're a subscriber, then you know that we've been making our way through the Hunger Games books. We've done Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and the prequel. And now we're here to talk about Mockingjay. But before we really dive into the plot of Mockingjay and an analysis of it, because this is the last video I'm going to make on the Hunger Games trilogy, I really wanted to also kind of talk about the trilogy as a whole and some of the overarching messages that Suzanne Collins put in there. There's some things that I want to point out that as we go through the plot, I'll continue to call out, right? So I wanted to kind of start with them. Peeta versus Gale. Well, one of the critics said that it wasn't erotic enough, which I cannot stress enough. That is the strangest thing to say about a young adult novel. I've made the point before that analysis is supposed to be what was the author trying to do and whether or not they were successful. This author, Suzanne Collins, was trying to write a young adult novel. So I highly doubt that she was trying to make it erotic. But if it's not made for adults, it's shit. We're not doing that here, okay? We're judging this like it's a young adult novel because that's what it is. So you have Gale and Peeta. This is a love triangle. But a lot of the criticism of it is that it never really seemed like she was gonna end up with Gale. Gale was never really an option for her. Mostly you as the reader the whole time want her to end up with Peeta. What if that was her trick all along? What if that's what she was trying to do? Hear me out. In the Catching Fire video, I said that I thought Gale was supposed to represent the path Katniss's life could have taken, and Peeta represented the path that Katniss's life took after the intervention of the Capitol and the Hunger Games and all that. I cannot believe that 600 people have watched that video, which is crazy, thank you. And none of you commented to tell me how stupid I was being. I was so wrong. I was so mistaken. They're not the different paths Katniss's life could have taken. Quickly, before we dive into what I actually think it represents, I have to remind you that Suzanne Collins' goal in writing this trilogy was to talk about the idea of just war in a way that was approachable for children. So just war is kind of a philosophical question, if you will. Are there situations in which actions that are typically deemed unethical could be called ethical? A clear example being self-defense. If you kill somebody out of self-defense, most people consider that to be ethical in a sense, or I guess better to say not unethical. You haven't necessarily done anything wrong. And in broader situations of rebellion and war, especially a people that are being oppressed by an oppressive government, is the violence that is enacted by those people to free themselves ethical or not? I would love to say this is a strictly philosophical question, but we see this pop up in real life all the time. And Suzanne Collins herself being the child of a military veteran, this idea hits very close to home for her, and she wanted to conquer this in a way that was approachable for children. I imagine partially because she was a child conquering some of these subjects, right? But also just because most of the media she writes is for children. So her goal was to conquer this subject that adults can't agree on in a way that children can understand it. How do you do that? Via metaphor. I don't think Gale and Peeta are supposed to be people per se. I feel like they're supposed to be personifications of the extremes on this spectrum, where Peeta represents the perspective that you always have to try and do the right thing no matter what, and that right thing is what is considered the right thing in normal day-to-day life, right? So that murder is still wrong, even in situations of war. And Gale kind of represents the extreme that any action is ethical as long as the end result is you freeing your people. No matter how many people he kills or how unethical a way he kills them, as long as the end result is that the people are freed or that is his goal through the whole thing, then everything he's done is ethical. These are the extremes on this topic, right? The truth lies somewhere in the middle. There's a gray area, there's a middle ground. Going all the way in the peaceful direction probably won't get you anywhere. But where do you draw the line? And at what point in that line do you become the bad guy? And this kind of general, really eerie question of how do we know that we are the good guys? And if we're willing to do everything they're willing to do, what differentiates us from them? So again, going back to the Hunger Games, if you make Gale the extreme that everything is always okay, the ends justify the means, and then you make Peeta the extreme that the ends certainly don't justify the means, and that you've got to try to do the right thing no matter what, then you can make Katniss the self-insert, which she obviously is, of the human being in the middle of all of this who is trying to balance these things. And we'll see as we go through the plot of Mockingjay how there are points where Katniss drifts away from Peeta and towards Gale, and then vice versa, and how these kind of directly line up with what she is okay with doing from the perspective of war. But I don't think that's all there is to it. I floated a theory out in my very first Hunger Games video that Katniss feels like the only real character, and that everybody else is very static, and that she's the only one who has character growth. Now, I called myself out for being wrong in the Catching Fire video, but I think I kind of nailed it right at the start. I do think Katniss is kind of the only person in this whole story, and everybody else represents something. Everybody else is a bit of a metaphor. So again, you've got Gale and Peeta, but then you have Prim. And the weird thing about Prim is that we never really get to see her up close. We never really get to know her. And I feel like that's because if we got to know her, it would ruin the image of her that Suzanne Collins wanted us to have. I think Prim is supposed to represent innocence, and it's kind of hard to keep a character completely innocent when you're interacting with them a bunch. And so by keeping Prim this idealized child in Katniss's mind, this kid that has no stake in this war, that deserves a better life. Like, she kind of represents the posterity, if you will, right? The people who will come after. Now, President Snow obviously represents the idea that human beings need to be ruled with an iron fist. We learned that about him in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. But what does President Coin represent? Now, she's the president of the rebellion. She's the president of District 13 and the head of the rebellion. What does she represent? Say what you will about President Snow, and you could say a lot. He's not a good person. But he never tried to hide that fact. And President Coin, I think, is more that politician, the snake in the grass, if you will. Then we have Haymitch, and this one's a little abstract, okay? I think that Haymitch is supposed to be a theoretical version of Katniss, who has lost everything. I think Haymitch is supposed to kind of be Katniss's future self, trying to stop her from making the same mistakes that he did, and point her in a better direction. They're very similar, and Katniss talks a lot in her internal monologue about how they are kind of one and the same. She says that multiple times, that her and Haymitch are like each other and that Peeta is not like them at all. So, with all that preamble, we can dive into the actual plot of Mockingjay so that I can argue my points, okay? We open on Katniss in District 13. This is about a month after the events of Catching Fire. She has been rescued, Peeta has not. She wants nothing to do with the rebellion. She's super pissed off. She feels like she's a pawn in everybody's game. She hates the rebels. She hates the Capitol. She hates herself. And she basically locks herself away. And we see her essentially apathetic. She's walking around District 13. She doesn't follow the schedule they give her. She doesn't do anything. She reconnects with Gale a little bit and starts to build up some of that anger, but it's seeing Peeta on TV, perfectly healthy, even though he's a captive of the Capitol, telling the world that she didn't know about the rebellion and that she's been kidnapped by them and that she's not on their side. Now, you would think that this makes her angry, but she pretty quickly realizes that Peeta's trying to protect her. He's trying to give her an excuse so that if the Capitol wins this war, she is not executed. And she decides that she has to do the same thing. She has to become a part of the rebellion for Peeta. So she's apathetic. She doesn't really have her conscience. She doesn't have Peeta. And she doesn't have the rage either, because she's not that close to Gale. She gets a little bit closer to Gale, but then she kind of sees her conscience on TV. Bear with me. She sees Peeta on TV, and she's like, I gotta do the right thing for him. I've gotta protect him. If we really, if we want to dive so deep into this metaphor, if we want to do our best impression of an English teacher who reads too far into everything, one could make the argument, this is the moment she kind of realizes that joining the rebellion is the right thing to do. She does it for Peeta, but if Peeta is supposed to represent doing the right thing and almost the personification of her conscience, that it's her conscience and her drive to do the right thing that is pushing her towards the rebellion. Because again, Peeta is not anti-rebellion. He just represents the perspective that you want to do your best to do as little damage as you can in the process. So she's sparked back into the rebellion in order to save Peeta, in order to save herself and her conscience. But she gets closer to Gale in the process, and through the whole beginning of the book, it's really Gale that we see her with. And who else do we see her with? Her own anger and rage. See what I'm saying? The next little bit of the book is a little bit repetitive, and I think that's intentional. So instead of talking about the specific instances, I'm kind of going to talk about it as a whole. So there's multiple points where they send Katniss into battle, but they tell her, you're not really supposed to get involved with the battle. We just want to get like shots of you near the battle. Because basically she's there to be promotional material. She's there to motivate people to fight, but she's not supposed to actually fight because she's too valuable. However, every time something ends up going astray, and then she ends up getting involved in the battle. And they get shots of her actually being involved. She's taking down planes with her fancy arrows. She's doing a lot of stuff. She's heavily involved in the fighting. And the things that she witnesses the Capitol doing get progressively worse, and her and Gale's actions in response also get progressively worse. So we're on this cycle of Katniss going into battle, seeing the results of battle with her own 2 eyes, and then retaliating. However, her opinion of Coin and the rebels is going down. Even though she herself is getting involved in the fighting and is willing to kill Capitol soldiers and all that, she struggles sometimes with the mentality of some of the people from the rebellion, and specifically President Coin. Her and President Coin butt heads a lot. But despite this, as time goes on, she gets more and more radicalized until at some point she insists upon a rescue of Peeta because they start to see clips of him and he's clearly being tortured. And so they go and they rescue him. And they're surprised by how easy it is to do so until Katniss and Peeta try to have a little reunion and he actually tries to kill her. Again, let's reiterate, Katniss has been getting more and more involved in the battles. More and more willing to kill Capitol soldiers to take down planes, more okay with them dropping bombs, things like this, right? And then her conscience shows back up on the scene and hates her. You see? You see? It's not just through Peeta's hatred of her that we see this either. Katniss has been full of self-loathing this whole time. She is convinced that if she could just be the perfect little soldier, that everything would work out and that no one she loves would die. So she's full of self-loathing, and then here Peeta shows up and he hates her too. And he's been brainwashed by the Capitol into hating her. Has Katniss not been brainwashed by the Capitol into hating herself? And then even through this, she kind of realizes that the torture of Peeta was to get at her and to break her, to show her that she can't do anything to save the people that she loves. So again, Peeta is the direct representation of her conscience. The Capitol is torturing her conscience and torturing her into hating herself and feeling like she can't do anything right. Here Peeta is and he hates her and he wants to kill her. So then she's like, send me to District 2, I can't be near him. She goes to District 2, and again, we kind of get a montage of them going into small battles with District 2, but the problem is that they have this big mountain base, and it's really, really secure, and it's really hard to, like, get into the mountain. So Gale comes up with the idea of causing an avalanche and trapping everybody inside, and only allowing them kind of one way out, which is under the mountain, and then they could all kind of stand at that one way out, and then everybody coming out would be forced to surrender. But Katniss points out that there's a huge risk of everybody within the mountain dying if they do this. Gale does not care. Gale pushes for it anyway. The rebels end up going with this plan. And this reminds Katniss too much of the coal mining accidents that used to happen in District 12, especially the one who killed her father. She's horrified. She's horrified by the rebels' actions. She's horrified by her own. I mean, she didn't really like say she was okay with it, but she didn't like put her foot down and stop them either. And she's horrified by Gale. Gale stands by his actions. He insists they're willing to do whatever it takes to kill us, so why should we not be willing to do whatever it takes to kill them? But Katniss feels like he's gone too far. And wouldn't you know it, Peeta shows up to District 2. So the mountain collapse happens and Katniss is immediately like, oh wait, I'm actually not willing to do whatever it takes. I actually do think we need to hold on to some of our goodness. And all of a sudden Peeta is there. Just quickly, I wanted to add, I can't believe I forgot to mention that Katniss gets shot in the head here by one of the people that she feels so bad about trapping into the mountain. So I didn't mean to imply that Suzanne Collins is pushing us exclusively towards Peeta here. Because as soon as Katniss turns around and is like, I'm not willing to do whatever it takes, I think we need to hold on to some of our conscience. And then she's immediately hurt by one of the people on the other side. Because like I said, on some level, some amount of violence is often required in order to free yourself from an oppressor, and you put yourself at risk if you're not willing to commit that violence. And so Suzanne Collins shows us this by having Katniss get shot in the head by one of the people that she feels so bad about trapping in the mountain. He showed up and he's not like 100% sure he trusts Katniss yet, but he like thinks a little bit that he trusts Katniss. He like understands that he's been brainwashed, but he's still like trying to like relearn how to like care about her and trust her. She helps him do this by describing some of their past relationship to him. What we see here here is an external representation of the internal healing that Katniss has to do, where she starts to trust herself again by building back up this trust with Peeta. But Peeta's handcuffed, he's restrained through a lot of this. So her conscience is there, but it's tied back, it's restrained. But she's starting to gain it back, and she's starting to build that trust with it again. And then through a convoluted series of events, she ends up kind of inventing this mission into the Capitol to kill President Snow that isn't real, and everybody that's a part of it knows that it's not real, but they all just go with it anyway. Just trust me on that. Believe me when I tell you I would lose you and you would click off the video if I described the events that got us from there to there. So they're going through the Capitol, and the Capitol is essentially rigged with a bunch of booby traps, and it's very representative of the actual Hunger Games, and they keep saying the Hunger Games are real life. We are in the Hunger Games. We never left the games, you know? And boy howdy when I tell you that Suzanne Collins was not shy with the NPCs here, with the background characters. Oh man, they just drop like flies. Through this whole section, it's like they start off with like 12 people or something like that, 10 or 12 people, I don't remember. And literally her, Gale, and Peeta survive to the Capitol. One of whom is Finnick, who's very well loved and who I haven't mentioned up to this point. I really think the other tributes are in there mostly to give Katniss people to bond with. Like, I think they all kind of show the different reactions that people can have to being given this choice. Because everybody put into the Hunger Games has to decide between killing other people or dying. There's many, many ways that you can react to this, and I kind of think that all of the tributes are supposed to represent the different ways that one can react to this. But Finnick's very strange. Finnick's hard. I have more elevated thoughts on this during editing. I said here that I thought that Katniss was the only real person in this whole story, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think all the tributes are the realist characters in this book, but I don't think that's a coincidence either, and I don't think that necessarily negates the other points that I'm making. Ultimately, all of the tributes are people who have been given this choice that I'm talking about. They have to decide what degree they're willing to go to survive. So Katniss is one way to react to this, and we see Katniss up close and personal with her struggle with this. But I said there that I thought the tributes were supposed to represent the other reactions to this, and I still think that's true. Instead of being metaphors for that, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, they are instead just other people who had other reactions to the same choice that Katniss has been given. So that is now what I think the tributes are supposed to kind of represent and show, and Finnick being one of those. Another example of that, but he also dies through this whole thing, and that made me the most sad. I wanted to see him and Annie have a happy ending. Me just mentioning characters I've never mentioned up to this point. Anyway, my friends are all chatting about our New Year's trip, and one of them just sent a message into the chat that says, I got underwear also. I was hoping we'd all bring underwear, but I don't know. I don't know what they're talking about, but I'll find out when I'm done filming. Anyway, so they sneak into the Capitol. People are dropping like flies as they do. And at the end, they get taken in by a woman named Tigress. Now, this is the one part that made me wish I'd read all 3 books before reading the prequel, because it would have been cool to have remembered Tigress before reading this. In fact, somebody called this out to me, and I was like, I don't remember that. And they were like, I think that's true, that Tigress is the one that helps them when they get into the Capitol. And I'm like, does someone help them when they're in the Capitol? I don't remember that at all. But I actually think upon rereading Mockingjay that I didn't remember 90% of the events of this book. So sorry to my friend that I told I thought they were wrong. You were right. Tigress is in this book. And she does kind of shelter them and give them a place to hide while they figure out the rest of their plan. But it's such a neat touch that like Tigress ends up turning on Coriolanus eventually. And I think her not agreeing with everything that Coriolanus does exist in both the book and the movie. You know, her saying the only thing I remember about your dad was how like cold and dead his eyes were. And as she sees Coriolanus become like his dad, like she's not okay with this. She feels like she's losing him. And so I think the fact that we see her eventually turn on Coriolanus and be willing to take in these rebels that she knows, like they actively tell her, we're on a mission to kill Snow. And she's like, I got you. Let me open up my basement for you. I want to know what happened in between the events of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes and the present trilogy to make Tigress hate Coriolanus that way. And the good news is, again, Suzanne Collins has hinted at writing more in this world that happens in between Ballad and the original trilogy. I would love her to. Tigress takes them in, hides them in her basement. This is where they unhandcuff Peeta, and they come up with this whole plan, and they all agree to kill each other if they see each other get kidnapped by the peacekeepers. You know, Peeta is maybe going to make a distraction if he needs to. I do think Suzanne Collins was very careful with deeper meaning in a lot of this, but I do think that this situation specifically was a case of her needing to give Peeta something to do. She needed to give him a job here, and she knew she was going to send Katniss off with Gale because she needs her rage more than she needs her peace to kill President Snow. And so her conscience goes off to make a distraction somewhere. I don't know. Sometimes things don't have a deeper meaning. Sometimes the author just needed something for the character to do. Peeta goes off somewhere to create a theoretical distraction, and Gale and Katniss start getting closer to the president's mansion where they see that there's this enclosure. I don't know how they represented it in the movie. I'll probably put clips in to give you a visual. It's like this glass box almost that has all these kids in it. They're capital children, and Katniss immediately puts together that they're meant to be a human shield for President Snow, so you can't bomb the president's mansion because you would kill all of these children. And yet, while they're standing there, they see these silver packages come down, and they look just like the ones that come down during the Hunger Games, so you immediately assume that it's the Capitol kind of sending resources to the kids, but it's not. They're bombs, they go off, kill a bunch of the kids, injure a bunch of others. A bunch of rebel medics run in there to try helping the kids that are still alive, and Katniss sees her sister as one of these medics, Miss Primrose Everdeen. Somehow Katniss puts together what's about to happen next. I don't really understand how, but she starts running towards the enclosure and screaming for Prim, doesn't get there in time, and the bombs go off for a second time, and they kill all of the medics that are in there as well. This is the end of the battle, both from Katniss's perspective and just in general. The Capitol surrenders after this, and Katniss is in the hospital with severe burns, and Prim did not survive. Katniss hates the Capitol. She knows that she's primed to kill President Snow. She's gonna execute him in front of everybody, but she's wandering around the mansion, and at some point she sees him. For some reason, they have him locked up like in his greenhouse. Again, Katniss is kind of immediately puts together that President Coin is probably being relatively nice to President Snow because it could have gone the other way around, and there's almost this respect between the leaders. And as she's talking to President Snow, he says, "It wasn't us who sent the bombs into the enclosure." And Katniss is kind of put in this situation where she has to decide if she believes President Snow or President Coin, because he points out to her that President Coin both managed to get the rebellion done by just having the districts rebel against each other, and that she did not lose that many people from District 13, which is her actual home. So all of the casualties were from the districts, and there weren't really mass casualties from District 13. And not only that, but he suggests to Katniss that the Capitol were not the ones who sent the bombs in to kill those kids, and that it was actually a ploy by President Coin. She made it look like the Capitol did it so that the Capitol citizens would realize how horrible President Snow is, and they wouldn't be able to defend his actions anymore because he killed a bunch of Capitol children, and that they would end up siding with the rebels and it would end the war. And she was correct. But again, it begs this question of like, the cost was so high, like how many innocent children did they have to kill in order to do this? And Prim, representing that innocence and the children of tomorrow, you see what I'm saying, sacrificed actual children and metaphorical children here. Katniss also realizing that Prim was 14 and had no reason to be on the front lines, and starts to wonder if President Coin kind of purposefully put her there in order to break down Katniss. Because throughout the book, and I haven't mentioned it up to this point, but people keep saying to Katniss, if you're not with President Coin, like 100% fully behind her, then you're against her and she views you as an enemy. So Katniss knows that on some level President Coin views her as an enemy because she won't just do whatever President Coin says. So she starts to wonder if Prim hadn't been sent to the front lines in order to kind of get to Katniss, so that Katniss doesn't have a lot of fight left in her after the war. And then, just before the execution, they have a meeting where President Coin suggests that they do a Hunger Games with the Capitol's children, one last one, as a punishment for all of the torture that they've done in the districts for so long. She leaves it up to the tributes, they vote on it, and interestingly enough, Katniss actually votes in favor of having the Hunger Games. Why does she do this? Well, in order to explain why I think she does this, we have to talk about what happens next, but I'm going to come back to this in a moment. So then they go out into the execution, and Katniss only has one arrow in her quiver, and it's supposed to be very metaphorical. They tell her it's the final shot of the war, but she uses that arrow to kill President Coin instead. she kills President Coin, President Snow starts laughing, and then dies in the same instant, presumably of some illness. Just a bunch of blood spits out of him, or maybe he like took a poison and killed himself, I don't know. But they die basically in the same moment, again kind of furthering that metaphor that President Coin and President Snow were one and the same. So why did Katniss say that she wanted the Hunger Games to continue? Why did she say she wanted a Hunger Games to happen with the capital children? Well, they keep saying through the whole book that the Hunger Games are real life now, especially going through the Capitol with all the booby traps. It's very similar to being in an actual Hunger Games. Well, I think that's the moment that Katniss made the decision to kill President Coin, that her agreeing to like keep the Hunger Games going, like they're still in the games and she needs to kill President Coin as a part of those games. I don't know, that might be a stretch, but that's kind of what I thought, because I spent a while thinking about this. It really confused me that Katniss went for it, because it felt like at this point she would have said like, no, absolutely not, we're not having a Hunger Games. And Peeta is horrified that she says she's going to, again furthering that like, you know, we got to do the right thing no matter what. We hated them because they had a Hunger Games, how are we gonna have a Hunger Games? And Katniss is like, no, I want to have a Hunger Games. And the only thing that I can make sense is because she's saying the Hunger Games are still going on, and my last kill of the Hunger Games is going to be President Coin, and then I will have won. You see what I'm saying? But then they lock her in a room for like weeks on end, and they just release her. And a whole trial has happened while she was locked in that room, and they ended up deciding that she was just mentally deranged. Everybody knew she was deranged. And so even though they never like they don't retcon it and say, oh, she was right, President Coin was awful, we're okay with her killing President Coin. But they also don't like punish her either. They're just like, yeah, she killed our beloved president, but you know, she was kind of a basket case and we gave her an arrow. So what did we think was gonna happen? And then they just let her go back to District 12, and it's like not a big deal to them either way. Now, again, they had like a trial and they like determined that she was like not in her right state of mind, but still, like she killed the president, and they just were like, well, she was a little cuckoo. We probably should have taken that into account when we gave her a weapon. And you're like, okay, so they just let her go back to District 12 and live out the rest of her life in Victor's Village. Her mom does not come back with her. This part was honestly really sad to me. They say it's because her mom like had lost too much and didn't want to go back to District 12 because of all the ghosts, but it's like your one remaining family member is there. I don't know. I feel like the mom is the character that pisses me off the most. Through the whole book series, I just don't like her. She doesn't want to help her daughter heal. I don't know. Very odd. But Peeta comes back eventually, and then her and Peeta spend the rest of their lives together. And they eventually have children. And that's kind of the end of the book. And she even directly says, like in support of my theory about this metaphor of Peeta versus Gale, that Katniss says that she needs that goodness in her life, that she needs Peeta. And that Gale is full of the same fire that she's full of. And she needs Peeta to kind of balance her out. Now you might be thinking, is this Suzanne Collins making the argument that we do need to do the right thing no matter what? No, of course not. Don't be silly. I will get to the Prim Reaper thing. I will get to the Prim Reaper thing, okay? Just let me finish this point. Katniss chooses Peeta, but not until the war's over. And up until the end of the war, Gale and Peeta are both there, and she's warring with both of them. I think it makes perfect sense that after a war is over, we would choose to stop killing people. So Katniss choosing Peeta, like, after the war ends, I don't think is Suzanne Collins trying to say that Peeta's perspective on the war was 100% correct. Again, I think this whole metaphor is supposed to be showing the internal struggle that happens within all of us in war situations of where do we draw the line. And Katniss is in that internal struggle the whole time, and then after the war is over, she chooses peace and goodness in Peeta. Now, there is also the Prim Reaper thing, which we need to get into. But again, it's all metaphorical. Like Gale is not a person. Gale is not a person in and of himself. He represents an idea. And it is the idea that the ends justify the means that got innocents killed. You see what I'm saying? Gale was the one who designed the bombs that they used to kill Prim. Well, that's not what they used them for, but still to end the war, and as a result ended up killing Prim. So again, that idea that the ends justify the means killed the innocents in this situation, the innocents being both Prim and the capital children that were in the enclosure. Boom. And that's it. That's Mockingjay. And that's kind of my analysis of Mockingjay and the trilogy as a whole. I'm sure if I were to go back, I could find other examples of Peeta and Gale representing these ideas, but I do think it's strongest in this book. But what did you think? Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm horribly incorrect? Comment below and let me know. I think overarching thoughts. Obviously, the Hunger Games are very good. They would not have reached the height that they did if they were not very good books. But I think rereading them as an adult gave me a chance to appreciate them in a way that I was not really able to as a child. And I'm glad that I read them both as a child and as an adult, because I feel like I got both experiences. I got to be the kid who saw these metaphors the way that it was intended, and I got to be the audience that she meant this book to be for. And then I got to be an adult kind of looking back on it as an author myself as well, and get to appreciate a lot of the choices that she made in order to make her point that I do feel like came across for me when I was a child, right? This idea of justified war and like, where do you draw the line, and the difficulty that happens within when that happens. And that's that on that. I will be continuing down this rabbit hole of reading books from my childhood. Is there maybe an Easter egg on my shelf as to what book series I want to do next? If you like this style video, subscribe. I've been messing around with some classic booktube videos as well, and I like making them and I don't at the same time. So we'll see what direction I head as I move forward, but I think I want to do a lot more of this style video. Yeah, I hope you subscribe and stick around, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!